Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julie Cullen, Managing Editor of American Nurse Journal, the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Nurses Association. I'll be serving as moderator of today's webinar, Stay Connected, Safer Enteral Connectors, Key to Patient Safety. Our panel of experts, Glenda Rogers, Mike Cusack, and Beth Lyman, will share a firsthand story of an enteral misconnection, provide an overview of the ISO 8369 standard and its global adoption, and discuss the implementation process for converting to the ISO standard tubing connections. Before we get started, I want to go over a few important housekeeping items. First of all, today's webinar will last about 60 minutes. You can submit your comments and questions to info@myamericanNurse.com. Second, a full recording of the webinar will be available within 72 hours, and you'll all receive the link by email. The replay will be available on demand for 1 full year, and you'll be able to access it free of charge as often as you like. Glenda will begin our presentation today by sharing the story of her daughter, Robin. Next, Mike will discuss the journey to safer connections, and then we'll conclude with Beth, who will talk about implementing ENFIT connectors. Let's begin. I'd like to introduce Glenda Rogers, who's a legal nurse consultant at Mosaic Life Care. Glenda, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Julie. I'm here today to share a story about my daughter, Robin. She was 35 weeks pregnant with my granddaughter when she was admitted to the hospital with intractable pain, dehydration, nausea, and vomiting. After multiple mistakes, Robin and Addison both died that evening. Now, this wasn't the first time Robin had had this problem. It started when she was about 11. She would start vomiting. She would vomit 25, 30 times a day. Get dehydrated. I'd take her to the hospital, ran multiple tests on her to try to figure out why she was having problems. Ended up down at Children's Mercy, and they concluded that it was autoimmune, that we would never find out what was triggering it, but they would just treat it symptomatically. They'd seen it before, she would outgrow it, and we would just go from there. So treating her symptomatically was hydrating her whenever she would get dehydrated, and then give her pain medication because she didn't get sick because of nausea. She got sick because of pain. So pain medicine, hydration, that's how we treated her. We spent most of that summer and fall in the hospital. But as the years went on, she did get better. So by the time she was a senior, she was only going to the hospital about once or twice a year. And was doing much better. She graduated, got married, moved away, went to work for a family practice doctor that found some medicine that she could take on a daily basis that pretty much controlled her everything. She very seldom went to the hospital. She did really, really well. She called me one day and she said, Mom, I'm pregnant. And I was a little bit worried because I knew she couldn't take her medicine anymore. That was keeping her from being sick. But super excited I was going to have a grandchild. So she did really, really well until about 28 weeks. And then she started getting sick again. And since she couldn't take her medicine, then she would end up in the hospital. By 35 weeks, she had lost 60 pounds, and they had started a central fund. She would do TPN and lipids at home. She would go to work during the day, then come back and do her TPN and lipids, and that's how she managed it until 37 weeks. They induced her a little bit early, and my grandson, Jarek, was born. He weighed 6'14". He did fine. He didn't care that his mom was starving to death, but he did great. There was some concerns about the narcotics that she had to take, but again, he did fine. So it was so wonderful. He was perfect. So she got back on her medicine, and things went along really well. But she started talking about having another baby. She wanted a little girl. And I was not in huge favor of it. I knew how sick she had been. And but she wanted to have another girl. She wanted a girl. So Derek came running up to me one day, and he had on a T-shirt that said, "I'm the big brother." And I looked at Robin, and I was like, "Oh, Rob, are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "You remember how sick you were with Derek?" And she said, "I know, Mom, but this time it'll be different. I promise, it'll be different." I said, "Okay." I'm having a second grandchild. I couldn't be more thrilled. It was wonderful. She did really well again until about 26, 27 weeks, and then she started getting sick again. And they were doing serial ultrasounds to make sure about the growth of the baby. So we found out it was a girl. And they picked out her name. Her name is Addison. They decided to put in a PICC line this time. So at about 32 weeks, they put a PICC line in, and she started with the TPN and the lipids, same routine that she did with Derek, she did with Addison. On July 15th, it was Derek's third birthday, and we were at their house for the birthday party, and Robin was so sick. And I said, "Why don't you let me take Derek home with me, and we'll keep him until," she wanted me to come down for a baby shower on the 18th. So I said, "We'll just keep him. That way Jeremy, her husband, didn't have to worry about daycare and all of that." So on July 18th, we were headed back down, and Robin called, and she said, "Mom, pack some extra clothes because we're going to have the baby today." The doctor that was taking care of her, that she worked for, had talked to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician thought at 35 weeks, the baby would be better off on the outside than on the inside because she was so sick. So that was what we were planning on doing, and I got about halfway to Robin, and she called and she was crying, and she said her OB doctor refused to induce her until 37 weeks, which meant 2 more weeks in the hospital, 2 more weeks without Derek. She was devastated, but when I talked to her and, gave her the old buck up speech, she had done it with Addison, or she had done it with Derek, so I knew she could do it with Addison. And we talked, and she was fine. So I got down and went ahead and took Derek to daycare because 3-year-olds in hospital rooms just don't really go very well together. So when I got to the hospital, Robin was in the shower, which was never a good sign because she would take hot showers 4 or 5 times a day because that helped relax her muscles and made her feel better. So I knew when I walked into the hospital room and she was in the shower that she was hurting pretty bad. She came out of the shower and she said, "Mom, I hurt everywhere." She said, "My feet hurt. My hands hurt. I hurt everywhere." And she said, "It started when they hung that bag." And she pointed to a bag of fluid that was hanging on her IV pole. The best way I can describe it is it looked like a melted chocolate milkshake. It was a big bag. It was probably 2,000 ml. And it was hooked to her PICC line. On every corner of the bag, it had not for IV use. And it was hooked to her PICC line. Well, I looked at it, and it ran through my head, well, this can't be right. I mean, nobody, must be different packaging. It was at the hospital that I work at, so things are different at different hospitals, and I didn't ask about it. But Robin had the nurse come in, and the plan was to keep her in the hospital for 2 weeks, so she was 37 weeks, and then induce her. And they thought that they were giving her too much pain medicine, so they were going to wean her off the pain medicine. And just, it didn't matter if she ate or not. They knew she was going to throw it up. It was just, they were just going to keep her hydrated for the next 2 weeks, and then they could have the baby. Robin asked for some pain medicine, and the nurse told her no, that they thought she was just anxious, and they didn't want to give her any more pain medicine. But they did give her some Visceral, which helped her relax a little bit. But even while she was sleeping or dozing, she was moaning because she hurt so bad. So about 5 o'clock, I told Robin, I'm going to go get Jerry. He's from daycare, so Jeremy doesn't have to worry about picking him up. As soon as Jeremy got home from work, I'd go back. I'd come back to the hospital and see her. So about 6 o'clock, Robin called, and she said, Mom, I need you to get back here to the hospital because they've done something wrong. And I said, okay, I'll be there. And had to arrange for somebody to take Jerry. So I got to the hospital and walked in the room, and Robin had on a face mask with oxygen, and her saturation was 88. Her heart rate was 150. And she looked at me and she said, Mom, I am so scared. I said, it's okay. They're going to take care of you. It's going to be okay. So I asked about the baby, and the nurse said they had done heart sounds earlier that morning, and they looked good, and then they had checked heart sounds, and the baby's heart sounds were 150. Robin's heart rate was 150, but I let it go. So they decided to she needed CPAP, and so they called respiratory. Respiratory came down, and they put CPAP on her, and her oxygen saturation came up to like 93, 95, so she did feel a lot better with that on. And the OB doctor came in and said, I think that they just gave you too much fluid in the ER last night, so we're going to give you some Lasix, and we're going to get that off of you. And I was standing by her, rubbing her back, and I could feel the fluid in her lungs. So they also decided that they would check on the baby, and they brought the ultrasound in and looked, and the doctor said, we probably need the big ultrasound to come down. This was just a bedside ultrasound. We need the big ultrasound to come down and really take a look at it. So I followed the nurse out of the room, and I said, did you see a heart rate? And she said, well, it's not a really good ultrasound. It just basically tells us if it's head down or butt down. It doesn't give us a lot of information. We're going to wait on the big ultrasound. Like, okay. So the big ultrasound came down, and they looked, and Robin looked at me. Big tears rolled down her eyes. She said, "Mom, is she dead?" And I'm like, "Yeah, honey, I think she is, but it's going to be okay. It'll be all right. We're going to be okay. We need to take care of you. Make sure you're okay." So they decided that they probably needed to send her to a higher level of care. It was just kind of a rural community hospital, and that she needed to go. She needed a nephrologist. She needed a cardiologist. She needed all kinds of people that they didn't have readily available. So they were talking to Robin about life-flighting her, and Jeremy got there. And I said, "You guys," both doctors were there, the doctor that Robin works for and the OB doctor, both doctors were there talking to her. I said, "You guys take care of Robin. I'll go talk to Jeremy. Just take care of Robin." So I went down and talked to Jeremy and told him that Addison had died and that Robin was so sick that they were going to transfer her to a different hospital. And I stayed with him for a little while, and then I headed back to Robin's room, and Robin's friend was standing outside in the hall, and she said, you can't go in there." And I was like, "Well, no, I'm her mom. If I want to go in there, I can go in there." And she said, no, you can't go in there. And through the door, I could hear them talking about bicarb and epinephrine, and I knew they were coding her. So one of the nurses came out about that time and said I said, "You guys need to tell me what's going on, and I need to know now. So find somebody that can come and talk to us." So we went down the hall to a little room, and we waited. We didn't wait very long. And Robin's doctor that she works for came in, and he said, "We have a pacemaker in her. Even with the pacemaker, she doesn't have any peripheral pulses. Without the pacemaker, her heart rate's in the 30s. And I said, "So if we could get her back now, she would never be the same." And I said, "Okay, stop. You can't be talking about Robin that way. You said you would fix her. Get back in there and fix her. You promised, go fix her." So he looked so sad. But he left, went down to the other room, and he was gone for a little while. And then he came back, and he stood in the doorway. And I could tell from the look on his face. I said, "Can you keep her alive long enough for her sisters to get there to tell her goodbye?" And he said, "No, I don't think I can." And then at 8:36, Robin was pronounced dead. So what happened? The nurse who had taken care of Robin with Jarek and with Addison knew that she was taking TPN and lipids. A bag came up. She thought it was her TPN. She chose not to scan it. She was supposed to check the order with the contents on the bag. She was busy. She chose not to do that. She took it in Robin's room. It wouldn't run because it was so thick. So she put it on a pump and started it at 200 an hour. And she started that at 11 o'clock, and almost immediately that's when Robin started having so much pain. So the nurse is definitely, she made multiple mistakes. So was this the nurse's fault? Yes. But if she hadn't been able to make the connection to Robin's PICC line, that would have been the stop. That would have been the place, even though she had did several other mistakes, that might have been the place that she stopped, and we still having Robin here with us. Now, I know as a nurse, 1,000% that nurse does not get up in the morning and say, I think I'll go to work, make a mistake, kill a couple of people, and then live my life. I know there was no intent. Everybody says she's a good nurse, that she took wonderful care of her patients. Robin liked her. She always asked for her whenever she had to be in the hospital, so she wanted her to take care of her. So not only do we have to live our lives without Robin and Addison, her life will never be the same either, because she has to live with that. And I can't imagine, I don't like our lives without Robin and Addison, but I cannot imagine living her life either. So Derek is, he's 17 now. He's a great big boy. He says he remembers his mom. Maybe. He was 3. I think he probably remembers that we talk about her. He remembers those stories more than what he actually remembers of her. But he's doing great. We miss him. Every Christmas, every holiday. Really hard without having Robin and Addison here. But that's our lives now. But what I really want people to know is that our lives and the nurses' lives will never be the same. And when you think of patient safety, tubing misconnections, I would just like you to remember Robin and Addison and their story, and know that tubing misconnections can be stopped, and people don't have to die from them if we just make the changes that need to be made.
Glenda, thank you so much for sharing that story. We'll now turn to Mike Cusack, Executive Director of GEDSA. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, Julie, and thank you everyone for attending. My name is Mike Cusack. I'm the Executive Director for GEDSA, and I'd like to take you on a journey of how we are arriving at safer connectors. Next slide. GEDSA is a nonprofit trade organization, and our mission is to promote patient safety worldwide through the adoption of ISO-compliant connectors. Next slide. GEDSA is made up of 38 medical device manufacturers from around the world. If you take a close look at this slide, you'll probably see companies that you're currently doing business with and many that you already recognize. Next slide. In addition to our members, we have strong relationships with a bunch of supporting organizations, both clinical and professional. For example, the Joint Commission, FDA, OLI, the Ministry of Health in Japan, the NHS in the United Kingdom. Next slide. Before I get into the meat of my presentation, I'd like to focus on what this presentation is not going to be about. The conversion that we're talking about is not a hospital initiative. It's not even a clinical initiative, nor is it being driven by manufacturers or even GEDSA. What it is an ISO patient safety initiative that's happening around the world. Next slide. A little history might help here. Let's talk about how standardized connectors came into being. So in 1896, a gentleman named Carl Luer invented an all-glass syringe with a tapered fit that proved to be much easier to use than the current connectors on the market. As a side note, his wife was actually the inventor of the connector, but because French law did not allow women to receive a patent, he was named as the patent holder. This connecting approach proved to be so successful that by the early 1900s, many devices were being developed and used in the marketplace using his device. However, a problem arose because under pressure, the cap was likely to disengage. So in 1930, a patent was granted for the Luer lock that was invented by Fairleigh Dickinson, who went on to found Becton Dickinson. And the innovation that he came up with was a set of interlocking cams that securely and easily connected the syringe to the barrel and prevented its disconnection from under pressure. Next slide. This scheme proved to be so successful that by the 1950s it was being used widely, and especially during the U.S. polio vaccine campaign. However, a problem arose later on in that campaign when a Dr. Albert Weiner was convicted of manslaughter for failing to properly sterilize his glass syringes in between reuse for different patients. That conviction led to a rapid increase in the use of plastic disposable syringes, such that by the 1960s, Abbott Laboratories, Baxter, and B. Braun all united behind the Luer-style connector for disposable syringes as the de facto standard. That went on to influence, in 1978, the American National Safety Institute to release the first ever Luer taper standard. Next slide. The success of the Luer connector led to another hinge point in 1988 during the air show at the United States Air Force Base in Ramstein, Germany. The Italian National Acrobatic Team had a mid-air collision. Flaming debris and gasoline fell down into the crowd. Hundreds of thousands of people were present watching. 70 people were killed outright and hundreds were injured. Immediately, of course, the EMTs from the Air Force and the local German state of Hessen responded, and however, a problem arose pretty much right away, and that was that the U.S. Air Force personnel were using Luer connectors, and the local German responders were using the Record connector. And that pointed up the need for a global standard for these types of connectors. Next slide. Another problem arose now because since the Luer connector was easy to manufacture, easy to use, and very secure in connecting, it became the widespread adopted connector for many different types of medical devices and procedures such as minimally invasive surgery. And therein arose the Achilles heel. Since it was being used widely, it permitted widespread possibilities for interconnection since all of these connectors were compatible one with the other. Next slide. In 2012, the Emergency Care Research Institute, otherwise known as ECRI, identified its top 10 technology hazards. And if you look at the slide midway down the list in blue, there are two bullet points related to connectivity. First is general medical device connectivity, and the next bullet point specifically calls out enteral feeding misconnections. Next slide. In 2010, Simmons and et al. Had completed a literature review of 116 cases in the literature, of which 21 of the patients had died. Just to put that into relation, the mortality rate for typhus and Ebola is about 20%. Also, last year during the height of the pandemic in the United States with the coronavirus, the highest mortality rate that was reached was 6.2%. So you can see right away that relative to these other landmarks that this type of mortality rate represents a serious problem. Next slide. Here I've listed from that literature review a series of adverse events and the outcomes. I'm going to give you a moment to read them, and then we'll continue. Next slide. If you were to walk into pretty much any U.S. hospital and look around and see modern facilities, up-to-date equipment, highly trained staff, all focused on the maximum amount of patient care, providing the best care for the patients in the hospital, you would think, how could an adverse event happen? Well, looking at this slide, I've tried to list out some of the potential factors that could influence care. If you start with low lighting, time pressure, which is particularly significant now during the pandemic when staffs are stressed, working double shifts. If patients are transferred between wards, patients with multiple devices or with multiple lines, all of this leads to the possibility for a misconnection event. And if you think about these types of accidents, what you have is human error. So as soon as you have humans involved, you have the potential for a human error. Next slide. Here's an example of a patient surrounded by a wealth of technology. On average, if a patient is in the hospital for more than 3 days, they will have come in contact with 14 different types of hospital technology, many of which rely on the Lure connector for connecting to each other or to various services from the hospital, like vacuum, for example. In the center of this picture, you'll see the patient surrounded by this technology. So you can understand now how it's possible for a misconnection event to take place when one or several of the factors I mentioned previously come into play. Next slide. As a result of this growing awareness, the International Standards Organization, otherwise known as ISO, convened a global effort to enhance patient safety by pulling together technical, regulatory, standards, and clinical experts, all to come up with a scheme for standards for use within small bore medical devices. That came to be known as ISO 80369. Next slide. So what exactly is the ISO design standard and how does it work? Here I've listed the 6 members of the ISO 80369 series, 2 of which are on the market, the enteral feeding connector, which is -3, and the neuraxial connector, which is -6. So what makes a connector adhere to the standard? Well, first, they all have to be mutually incompatible. That means each connector family only connects within itself and not across to other therapy areas. Second, the connectors themselves have to be made out of a rigid or semi-rigid material, so you can't force fit the connectors together as you could with a soft vinyl cup, for example. Third, all the connectors have undergone rigorous human factors testing and engineering testing to make sure that they function as they're supposed to. Fourth, each individual connector is given its own, each individual connector family is given its own diameter, so that is another step to preventing misconnection. And lastly, in the case of the enteral feeding connector, an extra step was taken. That was to reverse the flow so that the male side of the connector became female and the female side of the connector became male as an extra added protection against misconnection events. Next slide. I like to think of this scheme as an umbrella. So just as an umbrella only functions when all the panes are intact, this scheme will only function properly when all these connectors are introduced. I mentioned that enteral feeding that we're talking about today is on the market. So is the NR-FIT connector, which is for regional anesthesia, other things like nerve blocks and epidurals. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that we have strong supporting statements from our allies, such as the FDA, and here I've listed statements that strongly encourage the adoption of the ISO 80369-3 connector, otherwise known as NFIT, from the FDA, the Joint Commission, CMS, ASPEN, and the ISMP, all of which encourage hospitals to adopt these new connectors. Next slide. Looking at the adoption status around the world, we've been working on this for about 6 years. The European Union is nearly 100% converted, and other European countries are following close behind. If you look at Asia, Japan started in 2021 after introducing the NR-Fit connector, and Japan is about 50% completed with the NFit connector. Australia and New Zealand are approaching European levels at about 90% converted. South America, Brazil has just begun. Other countries will be following shortly. And finally, then you have North America. North America, we currently have about 30% conversion rate. Next slide. I've listed here the top 25 U.S. gastroenterology hospitals as noted by U.S. News and World Report, and you'll see a little bit down the list an arrow pointing to UCLA Medical Center. The reason I've picked out UCLA is because UCLA decided to make its transition at the height of the pandemic late last year. They felt that the increase in pressures on the staff, the increase in patients showing up in the ICU requiring ventilation and therefore enteral feeding suggested that this was the best possible time to be making the conversion to NFit. And so they did. My point here is that it's possible, even in the throes of a pandemic, to make this conversion and improve patient safety for all of your patients. Next slide. The products affected, let's start at the top. I've listed them here, starting with the bag at the top and enteral feeding tubes at the bottom. Many of you may not know, but the enteral feeding bags have already been converted. We're going to be talking specifically today about feeding sets, enteral syringes, the extension sets, and the feeding tubes. There's a slight wrinkle associated with the feeding tubes, and that is the low-profile devices such as the McKee button or the AMT button do not require NFit compliance because the manufacturers have their own dedicated proprietary connectors to their devices. Where the NFit will come in for these types of devices is upstream with the extension sets, which will be compatible with NFit. So to be precise, low-profile devices are exempt from the statute. However, the extension sets and other connectors are not. Next slide. Conversion goes beyond the pharmacy and other ancillary items. There are devices that you may not think about, such as fill straws, pre-filled syringes, bottle fill caps. All of those peripheral devices will also need to be compliant with the new standard so they can connect to the feeding tubes and other devices that are used to provide enteral nutrition. Next slide. However, if a device is used off-label, so things like a Foley catheter or a red rubber catheter, they are not going to be compliant with NFit, and they're not required to be. So the way I think about it, the way I keep it straight, is any device that's used to deliver something to the body, so enteral nutrition, enteral supplements, or pharmaceuticals, those types of devices that deliver something to the body will be compliant with NFit. If a device, on the other hand, is used to remove something from the body, so for example, a decompression bag or a drainage bag, those will not be required to be compliant with the new standards. Next slide. To help you make this transition, GEDSA has created a clinical advisory board of about 15 representatives from a broad array of clinical and professional backgrounds. The one thread that they all have in common is that each and every member has participated in the conversion of their facility from legacy devices to the new ISO 80369 compliant devices. These people have hard-won practical knowledge that they're willing to share with you so that as you make your own conversion, any hiccups or challenges along the way that you encounter, someone else has probably also encountered on the advisory board, and they can serve to walk you through how those obstacles were overcome. Next slide. GEDSA itself has established a three-step process towards helping you make this conversion, and we call that process aware, prepare, and adopt. So aware centers on communication with the greater community, what's happening, why it's happening. The prepare step focuses on education, particularly of the clinical staff. So, for example, nurses, what devices will be changed, how will they change, how the connections will be made. And then lastly, the adoption phase is working with your suppliers to develop a specific, detailed logistical plan to make the conversion. Next slide. The first step, when I'm asked what is the best next step to take, is to establish your internal team awareness. So Identify 2 or 3 leaders of the process and invite everybody you can think of to sit around the table as you get started. And by that I mean everybody. Don't forget people like your external stakeholders, prisons, VAs, assisted living, home care, rehab facilities. All of those people will be affected as your hospital makes the change. Next slide. GEDSA itself has gone out into the field and collected the best practices and examples of tools from hospitals that have already made the conversion. And anywhere we've seen a gap, GEDSA itself has developed an array of resources and tools, all of which have been archived on the Stay Connected website for you to freely download. The only requirement that the only step that we ask is that you give GEDSA credit for any materials that you download and use.
Thank you, Mike. And now our final presenter, Beth Lyman. Beth is Nutritional Support Nurse Consultant and formerly the Senior Program Coordinator for the Nutritional Support Team at Children's Mercy Hospital of Kansas City. Beth, thanks for being here today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion on NFIT. To set the tone for my part of this program, I want to share 2 quotes with you, neither of which have another that I know of. The first is, the role of clinicians is to take care of patients and to find better ways to take care of patients. The second quote goes like this: patient safety isn't expensive, it's priceless. Isn't the first quote true? I was a very hands-on nurse all my career and felt a responsibility to not only take care of patients well, but to also advance our knowledge of how to do things better. As for the second quote, who can argue with the premise that it is essential to first and foremost deliver safe care? Put these 2 quotes or thoughts together and you get the rationale for the transition to NFIT. I want to share the experience of Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City as we planned for and implemented NFIT connectors. Next slide, please. These are my disclosures. I now work as a consultant. I was a full-time nurse up until 2 years ago. These are my objectives for today. I'd like to just talk about the key components of the transition, really focusing on the timeline and working backward from there. And then I want to share some lessons learned. And the lessons that we learned would really apply to any hospital, but truth and disclosure, it was a pediatric hospital I worked at. So the first key components of the successful transition involved getting kind of a big picture group of people, most of them kind of leaders within the hospital stakeholder group that meets monthly. The stakeholders group will make major decisions like what vendor you're going to use, if you're going to change vendors, what the go-live date is, and things like that. Then you want to get subgroups, and these are kind of the worker bee type people that are going to actually organize the education, get the communication and the messaging down, and implement that transition. So in the education group, we learned quickly that we needed to include ambulatory care, inpatient units, and then the hospital education departments with kind of 3 segments with different agendas for each one. They met monthly to coordinate education activities, but not too far into this, they actually split off into the ambulatory work group and the inpatient work group to plan their education activities because they saw them as being different. This group put together PlayStations, which consisted of a plastic shoebox with supplies in it and a trifold poster with pictographs of how to clean, how to give medications, and key things that nurses needed to know. The communications group involved our hospital communications department, medical staff representation, and then they did the messaging for people like physicians, surgeons, residents, and coordinated communication outside the hospital to referring hospitals and emergency departments, pediatrician offices, and things like that. And they also helped us to coordinate the GEDSA summit that we had during the transition period. Then the implementation department was obviously, or committee was obviously essential in getting the job done. This involved a number of people from supply chain. I was on that committee as well. And the first thing we did was to kind of clean up the inventory. If something had been used once in 4.5 years, did we need to get an ENFIT counterpart and things like that? They did the crosswalk that was sent out to the nursing units, and then they planned the transition, preparing supplies for each nursing unit and every supply closet in the hospital, both in inpatient and ambulatory. So that was a big group. Then the go-live date. The go-live date is going to have to be set with administrative approval. We had wanted to go live in April or May and got put off because the commission was coming, and then we got put off because of a central line change. So we went live in July. So the go-live date, you want to figure out what month within the hospital calendar is going to work. That's a high-level administrative decision. Then you want to figure out what day of the week you want to go live. I don't suggest Monday. And then you want to figure out what time within that day that you're going to go live. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. And then you want to work very closely with vendors. The more time you spend working with DME companies, home health agencies, and things like that, the better it's going to be for the patients down the line. Next slide, please. This is the group of key stakeholders. And what I'd like to point out here is that what you really need is the role, so that if someone changes jobs, and people did do that during this transition, you need to keep that role. And so rather than taking the person that's brand new to the position that filled the person that left's job, we filled it in with someone who was familiar with it. For example, the supply chain person was promoted and took another job, and so then the person that slipped in place actually was working with her anyway and really knew what was going on. Nursing is key. Now, this is something that I get asked a lot of questions about, so just kind of think this one through yourself. Nursing is not across the board going to be speaking for the entire hospital. People in the NICU are going to have opinions. The ICU, they're going to have opinions. Med-surg units, home care, ambulatory care. So the best thing you can do is have some kind of offer of representation to those groups, to have someone there at the table so when decisions are made, they can say they were participating in them. Pharmacy, we had inpatient representation, but toward the end, closer to the transition, we also included outpatient pharmacy as well, and that worked. That was really, really helpful. And I've already talked about how many people in education were involved. Now, for the stakeholders group, not every one of these people, although supply chain, home care, pharmacy, and some of the nutrition people came, or nursing people came every month. But we made sure that we sent them information and they kept in the loop. And that was the most important thing. Next slide, please. So here's an example of something that we did to do education. We manned education tables outside the cafeteria from 11 to 1, Monday through Friday, for as many days as we could staff it, for 6 weeks prior to the transition. Now, here's the benefit of that summer go-live date, which I really didn't think was all that great to begin with because we'd have new nurses and new residents going live in July, but it did turn out that a lot of families came for those summer school appointments, so they didn't school, and they were there seeing what was going to happen, and they took pictures and got information. What you can't see here is the plastic shoebox off to the side and the trifold poster, but a staff nurse and I or someone else from the transition team would do this education. We had attending physicians come by, and the classic statement out of their mouth was, oh, this is about those emails I've been deleting. And so they would look at the things and really thank us, physical therapists, occupational therapists, nurses on the floor. It was really very, very helpful. So here's a lot of the information that the nursing subgroup on education did. And I do encourage you to really cue in on the education piece, because while the actual transition is a big deal, the better you educate your staff prior to this, the smoother that day will go. We had a video presentation. It's kind of like the Today Show type thing that comes out 4 times a year, once a quarter, and nurses get information about changes that are happening within the hospital, and then on that same email about click here for the Seasons of Learning, it's for more information, and then there were handouts that we provided. We sent emails to nursing staff called Just in Time Education, first a general overview, and we drilled down to more and more details. The PlayStations I've talked about. One of the things that we did as well is we created pictographs, and our home care nurses did this, and they did a beautiful job using an iPhone. And they just photoed every single step in cleaning and in different kinds of ways to give medications for families. And we put one sentence underneath each one for directions. Now, the advantage of pictographs, GEDSA pictographs that are diagrams that you can get on the website, and they're just absolutely wonderful. But download those, copy them, put them in those PlayStations for when you're done with doing education and you need to do family education. You can give out those pictographs. Not everything that we take care of as nurses are high school graduates or even literate to the level of a 7th or 8th grader. Not everyone speaks English or is fluent in English or can read English. So pictographs can be followed by just looking at the pictures. And if you don't believe that, look at a cake mix recipe. Believe me, pictographs have become very popular. Next slide, please. Now, education on the patients and caregivers is absolutely essential as well. Most of them got pretty upset that things were changing. They don't like change until we explained why. And we kind of told them a version of the story that you heard earlier on this webinar. Believe me, they're with you after that. Patient safety is always going to be key in the minds of a patient or a family member. We did the education tables, talked about the pictographs, and we gave them tips on medication administration, how to avoid residue in the moat building up by how to give medications, and not use an adapter or swizzle the syringe in a little cup of water and then dry it so there's no residue of sticky medication in the dead space or outside of it, so that you can prevent these tubes from getting clogged. We also had to talk about how they were not supposed to prime all the way to the end, because then that little bubble gets down in there. And just kind of thinking theoretically, if that's a new tube and you can't get that apart and you start using Kelly forceps, it could crack, and that patient could conceivably have to go back to IR or surgery to get the tube replaced. And then families need to know how to get those syringes and supplies at home. So in addition to nursing staff, which was a major focus, the communications department helped us with messaging for physicians, PR, advanced practice nurses, and PAs. That involved emails, a noon conference, physician newsletter articles that were sent out to referring pediatricians that was then shared with their office manager. And we had a webinar for referring pediatrician office. And that was very successful, well attended. Next slide, please. So, it kind of boiled down to us dealing with issues outside of the hospital as well, given the fact that many of our patients in the Kansas City area, they're in small towns or bigger towns across several states. So we needed to work closely with our vendor, meaning our distributor, and giving them the go-live date. But also the vendors that we chose needed to have 2 to 3 months to gear up and make sure they had the supplies there. And then we had an area-wide GEDSA meeting that was well attended by area hospitals, DME companies, and home care companies. Many of them had not even heard of the ENFIT transition. And the president of GEDSA at the time, Tom Hancock, because this happened a while back, came and talked as well. That was well received. And then communication was key with our discharge orders. So the discharge planning nurses worked with our IT department to amend the discharge planning orders, and then they made up a paper copy to give the ambulatory care areas for when we would see kids in clinic, then we would order ENFIT supplies, and that went very well as well. So there were a number of lessons that we learned, and I think that a lot of things were done very well because we shared the workload and we had a lot of people in the room helping us make decisions. So one of the things that we learned was that if your nursing educators will make that PlayStation and the trifold poster a competency, make up a checklist that they have to check off, they learned how to, that they demonstrated how to clean a PEG tube connector, how to clean a Mickey extension set if you have those in your hospital, things like that. The units that did a competency on the day of the transition did much better than the units where someone sent out an email saying, hey, we've got this PlayStation in the break room, go look at it, you need to know about this. That didn't help those units at all. Then the go live date, and again, the time of day, all of that. We went live week after the 4th of July on a Tuesday at noon. The value of Tuesday was that people, everything Monday is just catch-up day from the weekend, and Tuesday allowed us to have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to sort out anything before the weekend. Noon was helpful because prior to noon, all medications came up with legacy syringes. After noon, everything came up as ENFIT so that the nurse could have some time to change out the extension sets for the G tubes, change out the NG tubes, and there were patients that went down to IR and they had it all lined out to get their PEG tube changed out. Now, there were critical tubes. We asked on Thursday and Friday prior to the go-live date, we asked surgeons, neonatologists, and intensivists which tubes would put a patient at risk if anything happened with this connection and it got cracked and it had to be changed. And we had, out of 358 beds, we had 3 patients. And so they didn't, say, oh, nobody can be changed at all. And we used transition pieces on those patients until it was safe to change out their tube or they didn't need it anymore. And then we didn't crack any hubs. It was really very helpful. Okay, the do not convert on a Monday, I've talked about that. And then working closely with the vendors, they're part of the team as well. And I think that they appreciated the fact that they felt like they were part of the team. Now, one of the groups that I want to mention just quickly is the group of DME companies and people that supply the ENFIT supplies to our families. Some of them refused to honor our orders until they spun down their legacy supplies. And we were going to take a really hard stand on that, and then we just didn't. We decided that these people provide very good service to our families. The profit margin on Enteral supplies is not great, and if they would do it within a reasonable amount of time, that was going to work. And, it did work. They spun down their supplies, and then they honored the ENFIT order. So you might think about that as well. Well, I've enjoyed being here with you today, and I want to thank you for your attention, and we can take questions from the audience.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, we're ready to start answering your questions. We'll try to get through as many as possible in the time we have left. Okay, I think I'm going to send this first question to you, Beth. There are concerns about the low-dose tip syringe. Have those been combated or determined if that's misinformation?
Thank you for that question. Yes, they have been determined to be very safe, and I would just like to say that there has been some inaccurate information in the literature, and several members of the Clinical Advisory Board for GEDSA have addressed those both in print and individually. There are no reports in the literature. I encourage any of you to run your own lit search. No reports in the literature in the U.S., Europe, United Kingdom, Asia, of enteral misconnections or inaccurate medication administration to neonates, which is the big issue, using low-dose tip syringes. So anything that is out there that you're hearing is a lot of noise, and I encourage you to just think of it that way. There is nothing in the MAUDE database, nothing that says that the low-dose tip syringes are inaccurate. Next question.
All right, so here's the next question. ENFit tubes do not drain well and are problematic for our surgeons, staff, and patients, especially patients with thick secretions causing nausea and potential aspiration. How would you recommend we manage that?
What has come about since the ENFit conversion is the realization that gastrostomy tubes that are used for dependent drainage probably should be legacy. If they're not being used to give medications or feeds, and they are just being used to drain, probably legacy tubes, particularly for adults, are going to be the way to go, because the adults that occasionally eat something, they have terrible gastroparesis, and they have a G-tube to drain the fluids and any kind of little food particles that they occasionally eat, and most of them do. The mucus gets stuck in the ENFit connector and causing that patient to vomit every 6 hours, every 4 to 6 hours, which is terrible. So if the tube is not being used for meds or feeds, a legacy tube for drainage, I think is definitely indicated. Likewise, Salem sump tubes sometimes, can get thick stuff in there too. And we may have to flush those with some saline and then draw it back out, but they can be the same issue. Next question.
So here's the next one. How are vendors addressing decompression, suction, and drainage tubes devices? How is that being handled?
Beth, if you don't mind, I'll take this one to start with, and then you can chime in.
Yes.
So this is Mike Cusack. I know that among the GEDSA membership, there are several companies working on new products that they intend to launch to solve this problem. Those products have cleared the development process within the companies. To my understanding, they've been submitted or will be shortly submitted to the FDA. And then, of course, it's the FDA's job to review and get back to the companies. So I can't give you a specific date when those products will be available, but I do know that there are members working on them precisely to solve that problem. Next question.
One second. What does the July 1 adapter phase-out date mean for hospitals who haven't converted yet?
So again, this is Mike Cusack. I'm the executive director of GEDSA. I apologize for not identifying myself completely before. So what that phase-out date means is that the manufacturers will have agreed to stop manufacturing legacy products. What it does not mean is that legacy products will not be available for sale. However, each manufacturer has determined its own level of inventory that it's going to carry until the inventories are exhausted. So the immediate effect on a hospital will be negligible. It's not like you wake up one morning and the devices won't be there. However, you should know that the stocks across the manufacturing base will be drawn down with the expectation that at some point they will no longer be available. And during that time, the GEDSA members' expectation is that we'll work with the hospitals to help them convert over from legacy products to the ENFit products. Next question.
Okay, here's another one. Is there difficulty using suction to the NGT with an ENFit device? How do we make it work?
I'll take a stab at this one. So there are valves, there are adapters that can be purchased from manufacturers to allow you to hook that up to a suction. You don't want to use suction for a nasal gastric tube unless it's a Salem sump tube or a dual chamber tube so that there's air going down one lumen and the suction for the other. But you can get an adapter that will allow you to do that. And there are several manufacturers that make them. and I don't want to kind of get into that, the specifics of that. Next question.
Sorry for the delay there. Here's a question. My patients feed the bed with their current tubing. Can we expect that, or will it be better with ENFit connectors? And I think that's probably going to be our last question today.
Sure. This is Mike again. So I can say categorically that feeding the bed will fade into the past, because the nice thing about the ENFit connector to being safe, from a convenience standpoint, you're dealing with a positive connection. You put them together, you have that half twist, and they stay together until you disconnect them. So the inadvertent disconnection and that results in feeding for the bed will disappear over time as those devices are no longer in production.
And as a nurse,
thank you, Mike.
That the feedback we got, excuse me, I'm sorry, I was just going to say the feedback we got from families regarding this was very positive about not feeding a bed. So it absolutely is the case in clinical practice. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Glenda. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thanks, everybody.